I am Shazia Rafi. I'm former Secretary General of Parliamentarians for Global Action, which is the second global network of parliamentarians. I served in that position for 20 years and stepped down in December 2013. After that, I ran the Parliamentary Working Group on Clean Air with support from the government of Denmark to do some negotiations of the Sustainable Development Goals on clean air. We managed to get language into 3 of the targets. And then I formed an NGO to be able to implement them still using the same parliamentary advocacy model. And that is the organization Air Quality Asia, of which I'm currently president. And Dorota actually works with me as one of my colleagues. So let us begin. The topic that I was asked to talk about was how the combination of environment, population, gender, and health came together in the SDGs. And I'm going to take you back sort of 25 years on how, and even beyond almost 100 years as to, from the start, as to how we went from population control to reproductive health. So let us start. So this is a miniature of a very famous person. You don't know her face as much, you know her mausoleum better. This is the Empress Mumtaz Mahal. She was married at 19, died in childbirth at 38, produced 14 children, 14 pregnancies. She died delivering the 14th. She's a celebrated symbol of love. The mausoleum for her, built by Emperor Shah Jahan, is the Taj Mahal in Agra, India. To me, she also symbolizes why women of all socioeconomic levels need easily accessible reproductive health choices. So you're all familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals 2030. I seem to remember when I visited CBS that some of them are on the walls. All your governments have signed, ratified, and some, like Denmark, are implementing the policy related to them on both public and private sector entities. Key SDGs on women's rights and reproductive health were achieved after almost a century of activism by 3 different societal movements coming together in different periods of time. The environmental movement, the population control programs, and the women's rights movement. The first 2, environmental and population control, were Malthusian in their origin. They were based on Malthus's theory that as health improved, population growth would be inevitable, it would be exponential, and it would deplete the Earth's resources. The environmental movements grew in the late 1800s as unregulated development, primarily in the United States, started ravaging beautiful vistas and natural habitats. Strip mining for coal had devastated parts of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and industry was building dams and pipelines across the West and the Rocky Mountains. A naturalist named John Muir made it his life's work to take them on, advocating to the highest levels of government, including taking the president at the time, Theodore Roosevelt, in 1903 for an overnight camping trip, one-on-one, to Yosemite. Roosevelt agreed to preserve Yosemite under government protection after spending the night under the stars. It took several more years till the National Park Service was created under President Woodrow Wilson. It today manages 84 million acres of parks and monuments that have become federal land under eminent domain laws to preserve in their natural state for future generations. Of course, it's faced a challenge in these last 4 years. Muir then he had also co-founded the Sierra Club in 1892. While its initial focus was on wildlife preservation, creation and preservation of national parks, the organization eventually spearheaded with Greenpeace, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and other environmental advocates, the concept of sustainable development. However, it was not globally adopted as a concept till the early 1990s. The basic principle of sustainable development is that uncontrolled growth, economic growth, population growth, growth in profit was stripping the natural habitat and was unsustainable. Environmental movements pushed for domestic legislation in the US, Clean Air and Clean Water Act of 1970, a slew of other laws, and they pushed for financing by Congress to preserve the air, water, soil, and natural habitats. These groups joined hands with international environmentalists to push for the Global Compact to be agreed through the UN. In 1992, the UN held a conference on environment and development. It was also called the Rio Summit in Brazil, to agree on what they called an Agenda 21, an agenda for the 21st century. It was the first time that issues of population growth were discussed in the context of environmental sustainability. Developing countries were concerned that environmentalists from industrialized countries would seek to limit their economic growth and pushed for the concept of per capita energy consumption to be included. These disagreements eventually slowed down Agenda 21 implementation. As countries continued rapid economic growth powered by dirty fuels, carbon emissions rose to dangerous levels, as we see around the world. Environmentalists then ramped up advocacy around climate change and limits on global warming, eventually succeeding in the adoption of the Paris Agreement on Climate Change in 2015, which today is legally binding on the 179 countries that have ratified it. More or less at the same time, you have the women's movement and, as a consequence, population control movements starting. So women's suffrage, women's rights, and population control movements began more or less at the same time. Women were starting to get educated in universities and in the sciences. They were becoming doctors, scientists, public health advocates. Some of them became labor rights advocates in the 19th century, late 19th century, across the US and Europe. In the US, from the 1830s onwards, 7 women's colleges were established. They were called the Seven Sisters. I graduated from one of them. 1837 to 1885, these were set up because women were not given admission to the Ivy League universities. In 1875, women were given access to university education. In Denmark, the UK was the last one, really. In 1920 was the first formal admission of women to Oxford. Women's groups in England, America, Scandinavia started advocating for the right to vote at around the same time. As they were getting educated, they were like realizing, hey, what's this? Why don't we have the right to vote? So in the early 1900s in Denmark, women got the right to vote in 1915. In the United States, it took a lot more effort. We don't have time to go into it now, but the system here was such that it had to be ratified by 36 states with state assemblies voting for the 19th Amendment to the Constitution to be passed in 1920. However, it only gave white women the right to vote. Native American, Asian American, and African American women had to wait for further reforms in the decades that followed. And eventually, after it was in 1965 that African American women, the last group of women, were able to vote across the country. Around this time, there's a very important figure within the population and family planning movement. Now, I want to say one thing, and I'll come back to it in the Q&A, that both John Muir and the woman I'm going to describe, while they were towering figures in their own movements at the time, have recently been more discredited due to the Black Lives Movement taking up discrimination against African Americans. Margaret Sanger was a nurse who became a sex education and birth control advocate and started the movement for population control in 1914 all the way till the pill was developed in 1960. While Sanger today is a fallen hero due to her later work with eugenics, she was a colossus in the sexual and reproductive health field. In 1914, Sanger launched The Woman Rebel, a monthly newsletter which promoted contraception using the slogan, "No gods, no masters." Sanger popularized the term birth control, proclaiming that each woman should be the absolute mistress of her own body. Sanger initially viewed birth control as a free speech issue. The publication contained detailed, precise information and graphic descriptions of various contraceptive methods. In August 1914, Margaret Sanger was indicted for violating postal obscenity laws by sending the woman rebel through the postal system. Rather than stand trial, she fled the country. Margaret Sanger spent much of her 1914 exile in England, where she met British neo-Malthusians who helped redefine her socioeconomic justifications for birth control. She shared this concern that Malthusians had over overpopulation, that it would lead to poverty, famine, and war, in addition to what it did to the individual woman's body. She attended the 5th International Neo-Malthusian Conference in 1922. In fact, she was the first woman to chair a session. There were other women there too, Marie Stopes of the Fabian Society. Sanger organized the 6th International Neo-Malthusian and Birth Control Conference in New York in 1925. Overpopulation would be a major issue for her for the rest of her life. In 1915, Margaret Sanger's, so it's interesting, her entire family, both her husband and her first husband, second husband, sister. Are we having an issue with the slides, or because it seems to be like, or is everything okay?
It's okay, seems to be.
Okay, okay. Yeah, sorry, no, because I have brought my thing up. It keeps disappearing on my screen. Okay. So her first husband, William Sanger, gave a copy of Family Limitation to a representative of anti-vice politician Anthony Comstock. He was immediately tried and convicted, spending 30 days in jail. However, it attracted interest in birth control as an issue of civil liberty. So she and her family were people who would do things to provoke the state in taking legal action. Her second husband, Noah Slee, managed to smuggle diaphragms into New York through Canada in boxes. They were labeled as 3-in-1 oil. He also later became the first legal manufacturer of diaphragms in the United States. Now, in Northwestern Europe, countries had more liberal policies towards contraception than the US. And Sanger, in her international work, visited a Dutch birth control clinic and learned about diaphragms and began importing them from the US in defiance of US law at the time. In 1916, she opened the first American family planning and birth control clinic in Brooklyn, New York. 9 days after, she and her sister were arrested for breaking a New York state law that prohibited distribution of contraceptives. She was also charged with running a public nuisance and put on trial in January 1917. She was convicted. This is important. The trial judge held that women did not have the right to copulate with a feeling of security that there would be no resulting conception, meaning women did not have the right to separate sex from fertility. Sanger was offered a more lenient sentence if she promised not to break the law again. But she replied, "I cannot respect the law as it exists today." She was immediately sentenced to 30 days in a workhouse. An initial appeal was rejected. But a subsequent court proceeding in 1918, the birth control movement won a major victory when Judge Frederick Crane of the New York Court of Appeals issued a ruling allowing doctors to prescribe contraception. So this model of activism where you provoke the state, you put yourself at risk, go to trial, serve in jail under difficult circumstances. Her sister was one of the first people to be force-fed in jail. To be able to then overturn the law is a model of activism that was started by the population control movement and by the women's rights movements. After World War I, she founded the American Birth Control League in 1921 on the principles that every woman must possess the power and freedom to prevent contraception. She established the Clinical Research Bureau in 1923 as the first legal birth control clinic in the US, staffed entirely by female doctors and social workers. It was funded by John D. Rockefeller Jr. and his family, who continued to make anonymous donations at the time because it was illegal to her causes. In later years, she was accused of discrimination, partly due to the work she did with the African American community on birth control. In 1929, James Hubert, a Black social worker and leader of the New York's Urban League, asked Sanger to open a clinic in Harlem. Harlem, if you remember, is largely African American even till today. Sanger secured funding and opened the clinic, staffed with Black doctors, in 1930. The clinic was publicized in the African American press as well as in Black churches. It received the approval of W.E.B. Du Bois, the co-founder of the NAACP, which is the National Association Against Discrimination Against Colored People. However, she has a mixed legacy, as having also worked with the eugenics movement, and is accused of prejudice against minorities and people with disabilities, as her population control measures were seen as reducing their population. The most interesting era of her work for us is the work done with Planned Parenthood. In 1929, Sanger formed the National Committee on Federal Legislation for Birth Control in order to lobby for legislation to overturn restrictions on contraception. That effort failed to achieve success initially, so she turned to legal action, again to provoke, ordered a diaphragm from Japan in 1932 in order to provoke a decisive battle in the courts. The diaphragm was confiscated by the US government, and Sanger's subsequent legal challenge led to the 1936 court decision, which overturned an important provision of the Comstock laws, which had prohibited physicians from obtaining contraceptives. So this 1936 court victory motivated the American Medical Association, which is the most powerful association of physicians in the country, in 1937 to adopt contraception as a normal medical service and a key component of medical school curriculums. In 1937, Sanger became the chairman of the newly formed Birth Control Council of America, which then later in 1942 became the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. It is the largest provider of both reproductive health services, but also of birth control and abortion in the United States. In 1948, she formed the International Committee on Planned Parenthood. She had gone to China and set up the first birth control clinic there because women there were using abortions as a form of contraception. This eventually became the International Planned Parenthood Federation in 1952, which is the world's largest and non-governmental international women's health and family planning and birth control organization. She was the first president and served in that role until she was 80 years old. Her last achievement in this field is to encourage a philanthropist, Catherine McCormick, to provide the funding for biologist Gregory Pincus and Dr. John Rock, a Harvard gynecologist, to develop the birth control pill, which eventually sold under the name Enovid. Sanger died in 1966, about a year after the US Supreme Court case Griswold versus Connecticut, which legalized birth control in the United States. Now, I've gone into a lot of detail on her role because along with her family members and the supporters and funders she roped in, she created the legal space and the organizational framework for family planning in the US and globally. IPPF was set up before UNFPA. Now let's turn to where the women's movement goes with the setup of the United Nations, because that gave it an additional boost through several mechanisms. The first being the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As you may know, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt was asked by her husband to lead what they called a nuclear commission to draft the UDHR. So the post-war creation of the United Nations and the global push for women's rights, actually, it's a very interesting counter-narrative of what I call her story instead of his story or history. It's woven together with the role of women's activists, some of whom were also politicians. They were a parallel channel, which really makes a very fascinating research. Roosevelt had always believed that women might have a better chance to bring the necessary understanding to prevent future wars if they could serve in sufficient numbers in these international bodies. So at the UN General Assembly in 1946, which was held in London, she started by inviting the 16 other women delegates to tea in her sitting room at the Claridge's Hotel. The roots of the International Conference on Population and Development, the ICPD, which was held in Cairo in 1994, are found in the 1948 debates of what was the Third Committee, which is the committee at the UN that deals with economic and social affairs, during their negotiations on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The interdependence of political rights, socio-economic rights, was deeply felt by women like Mrs. Hansa Mehta of India, who was a member of Parliament from India, was on that committee, who had witnessed how women's right to vote is dependent on their reproductive and sexual rights that are in turn connected to equal rights regarding marriage and a woman's economic independence. So these women who were on these committees, and there were only 12 women in a 500-member third committee, had very much this holistic view of what it is they were negotiating. This third committee, the 12 women, also included a Danish diplomat, Bodil Bechtorup. 6 of the women were politicians also with experience in legislative consensus building. So they strengthened the push by Hansa Mehta and Roosevelt, who were on the main commission, on ensuring that human rights were explicitly including women's rights. One of them, Minerva Bernardino, a diplomat from the Dominican Republic, suggested setting up a subcommission on the status of women under the Commission on Human Rights. It was opposed by Roosevelt, who argued that a Commission on Human Rights would adequately cover issues related to women's rights. Bernardino, however, was a persistent powerhouse. And she persuaded, through pulling other Latin American, African, and Indian delegates together, to have ECOSOC approve this suggestion of setting up a subcommission on the status of women under the Nuclear Commission on Human Rights in 1946. Once it was set up, the 6 Latin American delegates were a majority in that subcommission. So from the first day, they pushed for women's rights to be at the forefront in the discussions on the UDHR. Joining this push were delegates from India, the Soviet delegations, other Asian countries. Bodil Bechtorup, the Danish delegate, actually went further. She continued to lobby for a full commission, independent commission of its own, called the Commission on Status of Women, which we now know as CSW. And she took the initiative on her own to start giving a breakfast lecture series in New York to the American public so that there would be pressure. And she also lobbied the first UN Secretary General, Trygve Lie, who was a fellow Scandinavian. Eventually, she succeeded. And it's interesting, the 2 countries that formed the Commission on Status of Women are 2 small countries, Dominican Republic and Denmark. It was turned into a full commission on the status of women. Its members are nominated by ECOSOC as state representatives. It has an annual session at which they review, including various legislations from around the world, also the CEDAW Convention. Women delegates also drew from their own experiences to include issues in the UDHR faced by women in the articles that were finally adopted. Jessie Street of Australia and Bernardino discovered they were being paid less than their male colleagues by their own governments. They plowed their anger at this discovery into the Equal Pay Clause, which had been proposed by Evdokia Oralova of the Byelorussian Soviet Republic. who was the rapporteur of the Commission on the Status of Women to the Commission on Human Rights in 47. So thanks to these women, Article 23 states, everyone without discrimination has the right to equal pay for equal work. Mrs. Shaista Ikramullah of Pakistan championed the inclusion of Article 16 on equal rights in marriage because she had witnessed in her home country that as a way to combat child marriage and forced marriage. In her own parliament, she had also debated with religious conservatives and found ways with her other female colleague, Mrs. Jahanara Shahnawaz, to pass laws for women's rights to inheritance and equal pay. So these people are drawing from the real life experiences of themselves, their colleagues, and their constituencies in parliaments to bring that to this global view. Roosevelt, who had to get the final draft approved by the third committee, assured the government delegates that the UDHR would not be a legally binding treaty or convention, while at the same time assuring the activists that the declaration would nevertheless have considerable political weight with a strongly worded preamble, so that it would exercise the greatest possible force of moral suasion. In December, finally, 1948, the declaration was approved by the Human Rights Commission with 12 votes in favor, none opposed, and was adopted by the UN General Assembly on 10th December 1948. Mehta and Roosevelt continued to work together in this Commission on Human Rights to get a subsequent convention adopted. It would be 19 years before two human rights conventions, one on political and civil rights, the other on economic, social, and cultural rights, were opened for signature by states, and 10 more years before they received enough signatures to go into effect in 1976. So these are the universal standards and the machinery for upholding them, which were the fundamental achievements of the UN, and the women played an enormous role in ensuring that they were truly inclusive. Now we come to the 1980s and 1990s. These issues combined with the UN's push for a wider consensus on development. By then also the General Assembly has expanded because of decolonization. There's a rising power of Africa, Asia at the UN. You have the first African UN Secretary General. You have a feminist physician by now heading UNFPA. So the UN's convening power and the agenda setting for what is called the Decade of Conferences from 1991 to 2001. Starting in 1991 with the newly elected activist Secretary General from Egypt, which is highly unusual because he didn't come from that as a background, Boutros Ghali, the UN began to bring people from all over the world together in a series of conferences to focus on key aspects of global change and development. These conferences include the UN Conference on Environment and Development, the Rio Summit in 92, the International Conference on Population and Development, ICPD Cairo in 94, the World Summit for Social Development in Copenhagen in March 95, and the Fourth World Conference on Women, Beijing in September 1995. Boutros Ghali declared the goal as an effort to forge a new consensus and a new understanding of development. A commitment to democracy is being recognized as both a cornerstone of development and a driving force for progress on all fronts. He was a complex figure. From a leading Coptic Christian Egyptian family, he had served as Deputy Foreign Minister of Egypt before becoming the UNSG. He could come across as patrician and aloof, but he authorized the widest opening of the UN system to NGOs, women's groups, and environmental groups. The number of NGOs registered and affiliated with the UN grew exponentially. They were given complete access to the second floor. This was a period when I had joined Parliamentarians for Global Action as Director of Democracy and Development. Government delegates were furious that us NGOs, whom they called no good organizations, had full access to the second floor and could approach them without appointments. I still remember Sir David Hannay, the UK permanent representative to the UN, calling me corridor gorilla. The Decade of Development, Environment, and Women's Conferences were accompanied by the UNSG's manifestos, an agenda for peace, an agenda for democracy, and an agenda for development, laid out the new possibilities. He also gave Dr. Nafis Sadek, who was the executive director of UNFPA, a complete carte blanche to achieve the strongest results for reproductive health at Cairo. Parallel parliamentary conferences, civil society workshops were held by UN agencies to strengthen the UN agenda and to be sort of like an outside ring of pressure on governments at each of these major conferences. Legislators in particular were charged by bringing about strong political consensus on controversial issues, environmental sustainability at Rio, reproductive health as a woman's right at the ICPD, equality at all levels in Beijing. Intertwined with all this parliamentary advocacy was citizen advocacy by the global women's movement. These parallel conferences adopted a rights-based agenda for children, women, communities, nations, and the earth. So there's a huge feminist impact that runs through this entire period when the NGO Women's Caucus becomes a permanent women's major group. Both the human rights and equality battles since the founding of the UN owe their successes to an extraordinary group of women's activists who were also politicians. Hat and shoulders above them in the 1980s and 90s was the late Bella Abzug, congresswoman and lawyer from the Bronx, New York, who single-handedly created the NGO Women's Caucus as a permanent feature of UN's development conferences. While she was a student, Bella had spoken to an assembly at Hunter College with First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. They both wore hats. Bella always wore a hat. It was her signature in these UN conferences. You could always find her and the women by looking for her hat. Bella attended the first UN International Women's Conference in Mexico City while she was a US Congresswoman. To implement the women's agenda, she and her fellow US Congresswoman, Patsy Matsuo Takemoto Mink, a Democrat from Hawaii, collaborated on legislation to hold a national women's conference preceded by meetings in every state and US territory so that the US government delegation would go with what their own women wanted to each UN meeting. At the Rio summit, every day the women's activists met in Bella's woman's tent to push delegations. Eventually, their demands were included in the official Agenda 21. She called it the Women's Agenda 21. The Women's Caucus played the same role at the ICPD, at the Social Summit in Copenhagen. In Beijing, Bella by that stage had become ill. She made a Herculean effort from her wheelchair while on the official US delegation to keep the momentum between Huairu, where the Chinese government had put the NGOs, and Beijing, where legislators and governments were meeting. Activists would run messaging relays between the two venues, which were 30 kilometers apart. Before Bella, government delegates would ask with a barely concealed sneer, "We don't know what you women want." By having the Women's Caucus meet every day, analyze the daily proceedings, prepare a point-by-point agenda of language they wanted, and handing it to government delegates in one written statement daily, she made sure, as she said to unsaid SG Maurice Strong, "Do you now hear the women, Mr. Strong?" For every major UN treaty negotiation process, the Women's Caucus has been an effective group. Women politicians have become members of the Women's Caucus have been members of this caucus throughout. Today, its successor, the Women's Major Group, is a key stakeholder for all UN processes. Now, I want to just bring a little bit of the two conferences that affect population control and family planning, which is the Rio Summit and then the ICPD. So UNCED, or the ICPD, or the Rio Summit, began for the first time the participatory process of global environmental governance as citizens' movements for clean, sustainable environment gained ground and actually had access to the conference. Parliamentarians also joined and led their government's delegations to UNCED. The US delegation was led by then Senator Al Gore, who chaired the Parliamentary Conference on adopting a strong Agenda 21. Women's groups were at the forefront of this citizen activism for the environment. They were a generation that had not only read Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, but had adopted it as their manifesto. And one of these was, of course, Bella Abzug. She had set up an NGO, Women's Environment and Development Organization, which brought thousands of women environmentalists together in Miami in 1990 to prepare the goals for the Women's Action Agenda 21, which for the first time incorporated women's policy positions on environment and development from local communities to the national to the international level for inclusion in the official UN documents. I wrote one of the background papers for that conference, having met Bella the year before. Part of the We Do team were, environmentalists from around the globe, which included Wangari Maathai from Kenya, who later became Deputy Environment Minister and later also got the Nobel Prize. Vandana Shiv, who's a leading environmentalist in India on sustainable agriculture. Bella herself attended Rio in what she titled as an official US delegate. The Rio Summit 5-year review strengthened this global environment movement's bond with the legislators. Green parties had already started in Europe and the Pacific in the 1970s, but they really expanded after the Rio Summit in all continents and continue to work in close collaboration with the environmental movement. Working closely, these MPs pushed their governments to open negotiations for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. They joined negotiating delegations culminating in the Paris Agreement in 2015. And then they played a pivotal role in ratifying the Paris Agreement, which was signed in April 2016 and brought into force in record time by November 2016, which is incredible. Now let's come to how this environmental sustainable population control model was turned on its head to focus on the women's rights and women's reproductive health the following years. The roots of the sexual and reproductive health work of the UN, as we have seen, started with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. UNFPA was initially, so IPPF was already set up in 1952, but the UN decided that governments needed to be brought on board through a UN agency rather than an NGO. Otherwise, they would not come on board on a big scale on family planning. So it was initially a population control program within UNDP, which is the development program. It was separated in 1967 and made an independent affiliated agency in 1969. In 1987, Pakistan proposed Dr. Nafis Sadiq as the executive director of UNFPA after the sudden death of Rafael Salas of the Philippines, who was the ED. Dr. Sadiq brought her unabashed feminism. She was the earning member of her family. Her husband, who was a retired army officer, managed the household and took care of the children, which in Pakistan is highly unusual. Her medicine background also concentrated family planning focus on the health of women and girls. In 1990, the UNSG appointed her Secretary General of the ICPD, of the conference itself. UNFPA, with support from the European Union and the Japanese government, then joined hands with regional and global parliamentary organizations to advance gender equality and to ensure that the laws were there for women's ability to control their own fertility. Sadiq chose as the co-chairs of the conference Dr. Fred Sai of Ghana and Ambassador Nicholas Biegeman of the Netherlands. Dr. Sai would focus on the substantive medical and health-related issues, Ambassador Biegeman on persuading governments to pay for the expanded reproductive health program. The goal on the financing side was that 2/3 of the funding for all these family planning programs would come from the national budget, and 1/3 could come from international aid sources, which meant you had to persuade both donor countries and developing countries to make this a priority. The Asian Forum of Parliamentarians on Population and Development with UNFPA support convened a parliamentary conference series 1993 to 1994, which included regional networks from Asia, Africa, the Americas, and the global network PGA, where I was working. It brought together 300 parliamentarians to work on the actual ICPD program of action. We worked with women's groups and reproductive health experts, advising these parliamentary working committees. 80% of the language that came out of these parliamentary sessions through 2 preparatory committees and the Cairo conference made it into the final document. So it was a very successful advocacy model. The very concept of family planning changed from population control to reproductive health of women and girls. Moving beyond focusing solely on fertility rates and demographics, the ICPD clearly articulated the necessity of recognizing that smaller families, slower population growth depend not on control, but on recognizing the value of women as an integral element of true development. However, the ICPD faced tough resistance from religious groups led by the Catholic and other churches. Physical threats were made against political leaders attending and the Egyptian government for hosting. Secretary General Boutros Ghali made several direct appeals to heads of government, including personal visits to their capitals. Despite the threats, global leaders were determined to show their support for the UN's progressive agenda. Among the many political leaders, Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto of Pakistan, Vice President Al Gore of the United States, and many others led their respective delegations. So it was truly a summit. The key here in terms of strategy were Muslim governments who opened the stage for reproductive health consensus. Dr. Sadiq and the SG had decided early on to work with Muslim countries and decouple the Muslim clergy from the Catholic and Protestant churches on issues of contraception and abortion. While many Muslim governments were part of this, I'm just going to list the ones that played an important role. The government of Egypt first for hosting the ICPD. Here, the interesting role was played by First Lady Suzanne Mubarak. Her father was a pediatrician, her mother a nurse. She herself had trained as a sociologist and was a passionate advocate for children and families. She was also instrumental in supporting the ICPD agenda in the face of threats from the Islamists. The government of Pakistan. Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto was a personally and politically fearless leader. Despite rising threats from Islamists at home and in Cairo, she led her country's delegation to the ICPD. I still get goosebumps remembering her address to the assembly as a mother of young children, defending women's rights to reproductive health in no uncertain terms. She also made the strategically winning move of appointing a Catholic as health minister. Julius Salek was a labor union activist. He used to burn tires in front of the Governor House, handing him the task to negotiate with the church as Pakistan was chairing the working group on abortion. The government of Iran, also the major Shia country in the world, had a robust family planning program which survived the transition from the Shah's government to a theocratic government, partly due to a very high literacy rate among men and women. Also facing Western sanctions, Iran had built up domestic supplies of contraception materials, so demand could be met without aid. The government of Indonesia had a very robust family planning program, and it was implemented with rigor by a secular but authoritarian government, so there was no issue of persuasion involved here. The government of Bangladesh was an interesting case also. Full-scale family planning, including early-stage abortion, because it was a secular leftist government. Bangladesh in its early years decided to allow an NGO-led development path. So leading family planning organizations were able to run widespread programs providing contraception and what is called menstrual regulation, essentially medically induced abortion in the first 40 days. Several other Muslim governments, Tunisia, Turkey, Senegal, etc., were also supportive of the ICPD agenda. So my project, which I was handed by my boss at the time, was getting the consensus on abortion at Cairo. And I'm happy to answer more detailed questions later, but I'm going to lay out a little bit of how we did that. So there was a role played by MPs, 5 parliamentary organizations, 2 years of intensive work, para by para, and the Asian Forum, which was leading the coalition, had divided the organization into working groups on all the topics. Role of doctors. Hundreds of doctors were on government and NGO delegations. Head and shoulders above them was Dr. Fred Sai, who was co-chair of the ICPD. He was the former president of the International Planned Parenthood Federation. Dr. Sai was a Ghanaian physician. He had held senior positions in the Ghanaian Ministry of Health. He had established the Ghana Medical School, headed the Planned Parenthood Association of Ghana. So he brought this enormous wealth of knowledge and experience. But what he really brought to the ICPD was an unrelenting passion for women's health based on linking unregulated fertility and preventable causes of death in women and girls that he had witnessed firsthand in Ghana. Dr. Sai selected the issue of abortion as the one that needed an extra effort on consensus and asked my team at PGA to take this on as a challenge. In my work with Dr. Sai, he was an important mentor, dispensing all manners of advice through the years, even after I was elected SG of PGA. The role of Catholic and Christian MPs was crucial. I want to particularly single out Nerissa Soon Ruiz, Professor Mona Makram Ebed, Andres Palma, Julius Salek. The Vatican had an observer status at the UN, which means they're able to speak from the floor during negotiations on language. None of the other churches do. NGOs and other churches are registered as, non-governmental organizations. They have to be outside in the corridor. Now, we were able to be in both places, the corridor and the conference room, because parliamentarians were able to be on their official delegations. So on each delegation, this parliamentary coalition had put their members as part of the official delegation. So Nerissa Soon Ruiz from the Philippines was 8 months pregnant during PrepCom 2 in 1993, but she was a nurse and she had seen what botched alleyway abortions did to women and supported a health-based approach. Professor Makram Ebed was a Coptic member of the Egyptian parliament and a women's rights defender. She took the initiative to host the first parliamentary session on sexual and reproductive health, which allowed everybody to come together for the first sessions. Diputado Andres Palma of Chile was a conservative Christian Democrat. He himself was a father of 6. Didn't practice much family planning, but he was an economist who was able to frame his eventual support through economic hardship of multiple births on poor families. The hero of the hour was Pakistan's Health Minister Julius Salek, whose constituency were Catholic and Christian voters. I'll describe a little bit later what he did. There was also a role played by key Muslim MPs, Dr. Noor Jahan Panezai, who was a gynecologist among the first female doctors in the conservative tribal belt of Balochistan province. She joined politics and was the vice president of the Pakistan Senate during the ICPD. Within PGA, she led the parliamentary working group on abortion. We worked together as a first step to bring members from all political parties on Pakistan on the same platform on this issue. Abortion in the first 40 days was legal in the Pakistan Penal Code. Using this fact, her own experience as a physician, the Quranic analysis by Dr. Umran, we were able to come to an agreed language. The role of Islamic scholars. Since Islam has no pope, Dr. Sadiq had to cast a very wide net to produce an authoritative position of the faith on reproductive health. Al-Azhar University was and still is the leading center of learning on Islamic law and religious interpretation. Set up in the 10th century by the Shia Ismaili Fatimid dynasty in Cairo, its scholars include members from all 72 sects bridging the main Sunni and Shia sects. You might remember that when Barack Obama was first elected president, he chose Al-Azhar as the place to give his address to the Muslim world. Dr. Omran, a public health expert, was chief population advisor to Al-Azhar University, and he was introduced to UNFPA by the Egyptian Population and Family Welfare Minister, Dr. Maher Mahran. Dr. Omran was commissioned by Dr. Sadiq to produce a thorough review across all major sects of the position of Islam on family planning, contraception methods, and abortion. It is a thoroughly researched treatise vetted by a committee of religious authorities from the major Muslim countries. He meticulously traced the justifications for family planning to the Quranic verses on God desiring ease, not hardship, favoring quality over quantity, and favoring advanced planning. On abortion, he documented the 3 tiers of time permissible up to the 120 days, and for some sects, after 120 days if the mother's life were at risk. The publication was threatened by fundamentalists, but Dr. Sadiq persevered. It was published, and copies were distributed to all government delegations. Parliamentarians were also given copies prior to the working group sessions. Cutting the Gordian knot at Cairo. So there were really 2 very crucial sessions where we were able to cut through the Gordian knot. But anyway, I'll describe a bit of the detail, and then later, if you have questions, I'll go into more. So from March 93 to September 94, PGA brought together a diverse group of members, including Christian Democrats, Republicans, Socialists, Communists, as well as Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, every religion, to devise consensus language on abortion. The Parliamentary Working Group on Abortion first achieved consensus among the Pakistani political parties. Then within a larger group who were also medical professionals and parliamentarians, and then offered the language to wider sessions of legislators in a series of workshops. Finally, the agreed upon language was taken to the ICPD through individual legislators on their country's official delegations. So the final sentence that came out of the parliamentary meetings was, for health reasons, on the advice of medical practitioners, abortion should be safe. I just want to tell you that the first draft that came out of the Pakistani session was that abortion should be legal, accessible, and safe. We then lost the accessible as it got wider, because accessible meant it had to be paid for and free. And then eventually we lost the legal because people argued it was covered under safe. It covered both physical and mental health of the woman, health of the fetus, and in a wider interpretation, financial health of the family. Medical practitioners included doctors, nurses, midwives. Safe covered both medically safe for the mother, but also safe from criminal prosecution for the medical practitioner and the woman. At the Cairo conference itself, the Intergovernmental Working Group on Abortion was led by Pakistan's health minister and parliamentarian Julius Salek, a Catholic. The Vatican requested a bilateral meeting with him, and he pulled me into that meeting as an observer. He brilliantly dismantled their arguments using the example of Adam and the creation of Eve. I can go into more detail, but it was very graphic. Backed by language addressing maternal health and mortality, agreed upon by all parties in his own country and the Pakistan's penal code, he had the confidence to lead that official working group to a consensus on abortion. The final adopted program of action acknowledged that abortions took place due to the failure of contraception, that they should not be criminalized, rather that governments were responsible to taking care of the women who had undergone the procedure. Now, where are we now and why it matters? Those of you who study development policy know that getting agreements, turning them into conventions and treaties, ratifying them, passing domestic legislation to enforce them is a long and arduous process. The Convention for Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, is legally binding in the 189 countries that have ratified it. The United States is the only OECD country not to have done so. Yet women are discriminated against in many of these countries. Enforcement remains a challenge everywhere. We also know that a change in the electoral politics of a country can send progress into reverse gear. On the issues of reproductive health that are so important to people of all genders, we are at a crucial moment where trends in opposite directions are equally strong. So one trend is the liberalization of sexual and reproductive health. An example is the Irish referendum on abortion. In 1983, Irish voters had approved the Eighth Amendment to Ireland's constitution, making the right to life of a fetus equal that of a pregnant woman. Irish women were forced overseas, mostly to the UK, to access abortion services in a complicated arrangement where the Irish government repaid the British taxpayer. Thousands of women also illegally imported abortion pills, risking prosecution. So this abortion rights campaign was eventually started and began to work to overturn the law. One second. Pressure finally came to bear when a 31-year-old married woman, Savita Halapanavar, died of sepsis while miscarrying because Irish doctors in a hospital would not remove the fetus, even after it had stopped having a heartbeat and she was already in septic shock. She died in 2012. This galvanized a movement where 3 organizations formed a campaign called Together for Yes, TFY, an official referendum campaign which held a successful vote on May 25, 2018, that repealed the Eighth Amendment. However, the legislation enacted by the Irish Parliament in late 2018 to implement the referendum, while it commits to free abortion, which is a major victory, does establish a cumbersome regime, which, according to some experts, is grounded in a criminal law framework and incorporates barriers that have no grounding in medical evidence. Availability of medicinal abortion is increasing worldwide, from approximately 15 million in 1988 to approximately 73 million medicinal abortions in 2019. 38% of these are in low-income countries, 44% in middle-income countries, and 15% in high-income countries. These rates are inversely related to the availability and price of contraception in these countries. So where contraception is easily available and is accessible economically, there are less abortions. 63% of women globally now have of reproductive age is counted as 14 to 49, are using some form of contraception. This is major progress. However, unmet need, which is women who want family planning but cannot get it, at 10 to 15% is still a high figure. At the same time, we have regressive movements restricting sexual and reproductive health. In the US, we see the rise of the evangelical movements, primarily Christian, but also in other countries from other faiths, that are fueling a rising patriarchy across the world. Unlike the more staid measures of the Catholic Church, these evangelical pastors working directly to change the political leadership at local, state, and federal levels in many countries, in the United States, in Uganda, Mexico, Chile, to name a few. Their goal is to criminalize abortion. They also have been working on criminalizing homosexuality. There is a narrowing of abortion legality in the United States, in Poland today, and several ex-communist countries. By the 1970s, so going back, in the 1970s, China, India, the former Soviet Union, and the UK had liberalized their abortion law. Denmark's Pregnancy Act of 1973 made abortion legal at the woman's request in the first 12 weeks of pregnancy. After that, there has to be a medical committee. As a result, about 62% of the world's population now lives in 66 countries, including Scandinavian countries, that allow abortion at the woman's request or with the approval of medical practitioners on socio-economic basis. In the remaining 125 countries, 38% of the global population faces restrictions, which range up to criminal prosecution for the woman and the medical personnel for performing an abortion. In the United States, while federal protection for abortion rights remains still under Roe versus Wade, it is likely to be overturned by the appointment of Amy Barrett to the US Supreme Court. She's likely to win that nomination irrespective of who wins the presidency next month. I think they're putting it to a vote on Sunday or Monday in the Senate, where the Republicans currently have a majority. At the state level, liberal states such as New York, California, etc., have legal and safe abortion provisions. However, anti-abortion groups have managed to pressure medical schools to phase out the teaching of late-term and even in some cases middle-term abortion. They have also pressured insurance companies to raise fees on doctors who perform them. As a result, the doctors who know how to perform them are rare and are nearing retirement age. These social movements, so, things happen because there's also a demographic pressure. These social movements are playing off the demographic challenge that all societies face as education and health expand. The ratio of working age, non-working age population begins to drop as society's health improves and the elderly population grows. North America has traditionally dealt with this challenge through open immigration of young workers from other parts of the world. In recent years, however, we're seeing a backlash and a hatred and violence against immigrants. Under this administration, there has been open discrimination and almost an incitement to violence by the president himself. For societies that are not open to immigration and assimilation of other races, one effect is that there is increased pressure on women to leave the labor force and produce more children. However, that's very hard to really enforce. Despite monetary incentives for mothers by some governments, women are reluctant to leave the workforce. Birth rates remain low in high-income countries. So where does all this leave us? Biologically, bearing children is ideally done between the ages of 25 to 40. Younger than 25, you want women still to be getting education and reaching their academic potential. After 40, it becomes harder. And this role of bearing children is still that of women, whether they are in a couple or they are a surrogate. These are also the years that jobs and career development require the most intensive work. Children also need quantity time with their caregivers while they're growing up. Where the laws on parenting leave, childcare are progressive, and both partners can take on a more equitable role, as in Denmark, it can be easier on the family. I haven't studied the parenting roles in couples who adopt to know if childcare arrangements are different in that more deliberated context. Employers who provide more flexibility in hours, more childcare services, also need financial incentives through government tax credit schemes and other compensation. This is important so that employers continue to hire and promote in a gender-blind manner. And several of you will be in that position of being that kind of employer. I hope this has given you an overview of how the work on sexual and reproductive health developed over the past 100 years, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I was mute, but please let's open the floor and have some questions from the students. If you happen to have some questions.
I think you'll have to unmute people because I see people are still muted.
But they can unmute themselves when they're about to talk or have a question. Yes.
Maria, you might want to lead the first question because
yeah, exactly.
Of 100 years with so many treaties, etc., it's not so easy to figure out what the question should be.
It's quite a big story, and I just was going to share this slide and then ask you to comment about it. It's oops, sorry. Oh, I went to the next slide and I don't know how to go back to. I'll stop sharing and I'll go back to which is the slide that I want to share. Oh, I don't know. It's because the question is related to that slide. It's here we go. It's just a question whether in your interpretation then we have a success story, and then you will back up this. This is a chart that is describing how we have a success story in terms of population, and then how the majority of the countries are now in the category joining the developed countries in terms of having small families and fewer children that die. And then of course there is a number of countries that are still on the process, but the idea that there was countries that were having, I mean, the majority of countries are developing countries, are in the category of having big families and many children that die. It's something that we have been living in the past, and now it's something that we are kind of evolving towards this kind of small families and fewer children that die. Would you agree with this
I think it is a
depiction?
success. It is a success because, I mean, um, as it is very hard on families to produce that, for women to bear that many children as a burden on their health, and then to see that some of them will not survive. I mean, the emotional pain is the same for every child that you lose. So the fact that you have smaller families, that you are able to see them educated, you're able to see them living fruitful lives, is a wonderful thing for the family unit. Yes, it does mean that your age profile over time as health improves changes. I mean, my last chart shows you that in North America and Europe, the percentage of the elderly population is rising. And if you keep your retirement ages the same, you are going to have less working age population having to carry the economic burden. But I think part of this whole picture is also how we define work, how we actually define what is fruitful work, how we define what we consider an economic success. So part of what is happening, I think, over time is that as the burden of childbearing, caregiving for the elderly begins to be more shared between the men and women in a family, that concept of what is a successful career, how much money it brings in, what kind of lifestyle it brings in, will also change. And this is where also the environmental sustainability comes in, because the environmental sustainability is saying to you, do you really need 3 cars in the garage? Do you really need all of this high consumption per capita that you are doing? So I think it is a success story. I mean, I know my grandmother was the last one in our family generation who gave birth to 7 children, and not all of them survived. It's a very painful thing. It's not something that we would want to continue.
Yeah.
What I would say. So it's a huge success of the family planning movements. Yes, some of them became very draconian on population control, but that was adjusted to a great degree by Cairo. And it's also been adjusted by medical advancement. I mean, the pill was a major advancement because women could take the pill without their mother-in-law knowing, without their, even in some cases without their husband knowing. So it was something that was in the woman's control.
If they
And
can buy the pill, right?
there are more and more of those kinds of technological developments that still need to happen, because medical research field, the gender balance is totally off. While you'll find a lot of gynecologists might be women, but the ones doing the research that are developing things are still men. So that aspect is one that needs to change also along with this. One other thing I think which has also important. I didn't go into it in too much detail, but it is one thing that Scandinavian countries do a little bit of, others need to start, which is that the work that is done to take care of children, to take care of the family, to take care of the elderly is not accounted for and paid for. In most situations, it is unpaid work. It is not even documented. So Norway, I think, was the first one to do a survey that people fill out of how many hours they put in every month. And then every 10 years, they adjust the Social Security payments accordingly. So that while you as a woman are not getting paid by the state for the care you are giving now, you will be getting more in your retirement Social Security when you retire as a result of all those hours that you have put in. But this whole issue of counting the women's contribution, some estimates, the IMF has estimated that it would add 25% to 30% to a country's GDP, which is a huge figure. But because nobody is actually filling out those hour sheets and nobody is counting them, we don't really know.
Right. I have another question. I don't know if anybody has questions. Mara, do you have a question? I don't want to ask all the questions, but I have a question regarding the topic of population control as such.
Mm-hmm.
Is it really gone from the conversation, or is it still pretty much well and alive, the population
No,
control?
it's gone from the conversation. It's disappeared from all the documents at the UN. It has disappeared from really politicians' speeches to a great degree around the world. I mean, even in China now, their problem is that they went so far down the one-child policy that they now find in China and in India for different reasons that millions of girls are missing because they've been doing selective abortions of female fetuses as technology has allowed them through sonograms to be able to tell whether the fetus is female or male. So population control itself has really gone. But the programs it designed are still there. And the worry that I have is that some elements of that could come back because when you look at, for example, what the United States has recently done to people that it put into concentration camps along the Mexican border, there were doctors who did forced hysterectomies of women who were in jail. Yeah. I mean, there's lawsuits coming that are prepared for that. So the capacity of a state which becomes a fascist state, which becomes a racist, fascist combination, can use those tools of population control if they want to control the racial mix of their population. So the problem is not so much whether it is still there in the language, it's whether it has been totally dismantled in its procedures.
Yeah, I agree. And then I have one more question regarding if nobody, then I'll take the lead. Religion, the role of religion, and then you mentioned that in this consensus in Kairos, there was a number of religious figures that were kind of a part of the whole process. And you mentioned Muslims and Christians, Islamic representatives, but you didn't mention any from India, from the Hindu
Um,
community.
the
Is it?
Hindu community did not have much of an issue with family planning and even abortion. It's legal in India.
Oh, okay,
So
that's interesting.
really the Christian faiths that had the biggest problem with it. And among the Islamic faiths, there is very much this barrier of 120 days because there is some saying of the Prophet that ensoulment takes place at the 120th day, which is 4 months.
Hmm.
So I think the bigger barrier there was that even if ensoulment has taken place, and the life of the mother is threatened, which life are you going to, favor? And most schools would say you favor the life of the mother. That is the life that is already formed, that is already there, that is already functioning.
Hmm.
But I think the Buddhists also, we didn't end up with any issues. Really, it was the various Christian faiths, and it really boils down to where the fetus develops what they consider a soul. Now, in the very extreme Christian faiths, they think that life begins at conception. So even family planning methods are not allowed. In the Islamic faith, no, there are these 3 stages where it's an embryo, where it's a fetus, where it's whatever, and then in the 120th day is considered a day at which but even then, the majority of the schools felt that the life of the mother um, takes precedence.
Okay.
I'll ask a question if nobody's going to go, although that's really abusing my prerogative because
No, please.
I can ask her a question.
Please come. Please come.
But you, part of the story of, the role that some kind of progressive Muslim leaders played in the period that you're describing is the fact that there were some Muslim majority countries at the time that either had progressive democratically elected leaders, and you alluded to this a little bit in your comments about Indonesia, but I think we could also maybe say this about Egypt, that there were also countries at the time, Muslim majority countries, that had pretty authoritarian governments, but where those authoritarian governments were fairly secular.
Right.
And that made a difference. And although, of course, there were, radical Islamic fundamentalist Islamist movements on the rise during this period, they were not necessarily the government in the majority of these countries at that time.
Right.
That has changed quite a lot. And I wonder whether, much in the way that in the US, there has been a certain regression away from kind of achievements that were made in the 70s as some of these more conservative forces have risen on the political scene. Should we be worried in parts of the Muslim world where the political center of gravity has moved dramatically in the direction of fundamentalism, and that has happened over the last 20, 25 years in a lot of these countries, about regression on these issues?
So I think the movement that you have to be the most worried about is really the Wahhabi Hanbali school, which is the school from Saudi Arabia, the Gulf countries. Now, these are countries that traditionally do not have a population pressure. Huge amounts of space, huge amounts of resources, not much population. So the schools, more conservative, abortion not allowed, method of thinking fits within their own national context. But as this particular movement grew after the oil prices went up and they started to proselytize in other Muslim countries, such as Pakistan, such as Indonesia, such as India, such as, not Muslim country, but large population around the world, and Afghanistan is an example of the Taliban, not just family planning and birth control, but also the status of women, what women were allowed or not allowed to do, came under enormous threat. So I think you do have to be worried. The only thing that I think is there is that at the same time, the education rates of women, even in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, are very high. They themselves are in the workforce. They are working in sort of separate but equal setups, women's banks, women's universities, women's schools. And in many of the countries where they are proselytizing and building Wahhabi mosques and increasing this Wahhabi context, including in Europe, I mean, a lot of the mosques are funded by, from Saudi money and Gulf money. the notion of an educated woman who has a job and then is kind of an Amy Cohen Barrett in her thinking is I wouldn't say very likely. It does happen. I mean, if it's happening in the US and she's going to end up on the Supreme Court with the kind of crazy thinking that she has, this issue is there. But whether laws themselves will change, I have not yet seen that happen, partly because in many of these countries, a lot of what takes place is not connected to the law. So, for example, in Bangladesh, menstrual regulation has been taking place, whether it's called abortion or not, whether it's covered under a permissive law or not. But yes, there is a worry that as more of the funding and the nature of the sect that Muslims are following in these countries and in countries where they are a minority, changes towards the more conservative, because the same shift to the right, the same shift to conservatism is taking place in almost every religion. You see it among the Hindus, you see it among Buddhists, you see it among Muslims. And it's kind of a combination of both fundamentalism, conservatism politically, but there's also a rise of fascism in every single religious and racial context happening around the world, where democracy is declining and human rights adherence is declining.
Maybe I can follow up with the question then. If aside from this political and cultural shift, there is also now with the COVID-19 some economic involution, I think, in some of the poorer areas in Latin America, at least. I don't know in Asia, but do you see that there will be some devolution there with this if there is less access to health and all of these things, and then lack of jobs?
There's going to be a massive impact on the socioeconomic status of women, because if jobs are lost, societies still revert to the men first model. And if you are worried about going to, I mean, in the US, we face that 225,000 people have died in the US as of related to COVID. We do not know how many COVID-related deaths have taken place because people were too scared to go to the hospital, even if they were having a stroke or a heart attack. So are women going to be less likely to go to family planning clinics because they're under lockdown? I mean, these are elements that are going to affect the picture.
Yeah. Any other question from the students?
It's a lot to swallow.
Yeah.
I have one.
Yes, Helene.
I'll see if I can phrase it so it makes sense. But it was more I was wondering, because you said in the start that that from the developing countries in some way, like that in the start it was more seen as a way of imposing some way to harm or like control the economic growth of these countries.
Mm-hmm.
So what I was wondering was more like if this like intersection of post-colonialism and reproductive health, like if it's like crossed since, or how it's like worked today, if there's still like this global power.
Still this global thing. So at that time, there definitely was, because the Agenda 21 and the Rio Summit was, very much led by Western environmental movements. There were a few people from, like the Vandana Shivs and the Wangari Maathais who were like totally committed environmentalists, but the developing countries had to be kind of dragged along. And even the legislators from our organization, for example, who joined that meeting with Senator Al Gore, they were the ones who put in this language on per capita consumption. They said that it's not just the numbers of people, but also how they are consuming that matters. And when you add that lens, India is consuming less than the US, for example. But I think what has happened since then is that the actual impact of climate change is so heavy and so hard on all these countries. Pakistan, for example, is the fifth country, fifth in the world for negative impact on climate change. So, you've got this combination of droughts, floods, forest fires, earthquakes, you name it, that is happening at an unprecedented rate, so that even those countries, politicians and others have begun to realize that no, we can't just go on that model that that it really is in some ways unsustainable. Now, what you do as a result and how do you make that do equitable is the big challenge, because obviously in, let's say, a developed country, your government's first responsibility is to the economic well-being of your own citizens. Foreign aid comes later on in the budget. So where is the funding going to come from to pay for the reset? And I think that's where the challenge really lies. And here, some of the work that your colleagues, your professors are doing on the corporate sector are pretty important, because the people who are getting away with creating wealth but not allowing it to be used for social good are the corporate sector, because their entire model is based on their quarterly profits and their stock prices, and not on what they must pay back to society in terms of taxes, etc., etc. So that when they are lobbying for the opposite, they're always lobbying for things to be reduced. In the last 4 years in the US, they have lobbied for polluters to become the head of the EPA, to shut down regulations, to loosen regulations. So that is the sector that really needs to become more morally cognizant and also more responsible. So actually, you as the people who are studying in the Copenhagen Business School have a huge responsibility, because it's your sector which you will go to work in that will have to play that role, because governments are stretched everywhere.
Thank you. Any other question? I have one more that could be the last one, the closing question, since we have not taken a break, and I think we are just coming. It's at 5:15, right? That we stop. Yeah. It's basically, where do you see these women conferences moving in the coming years, and whether you see some leaders that are now taking this either regionally or in the global stage. How do you see this evolving?
So I'm one of the odd ones in this area. The UN has this tendency every 5 years to do a review conference, and they're doing one on Beijing also, 25 years, whatever. I disagree. I think that, when you've achieved a consensus of that magnitude, you leave the Bible as it is. You go to what you can do in terms of implementation and stop reviewing everything, because each time you go in for the review, the people who were defeated at that conference come back to try and weaken the language, come back to try and weaken the norm, come back to try and weaken the constitution, whatever. So I am of the view that the area which really women need to concentrate on is they need to run for office at local, state, federal, regional levels. They need to be corporate leaders. They need to run for positions of power themselves. Our generation, we were the first ones that said, okay, yeah, I can also be SG. I mean, when I was asked to put in my CV for the SG, my first thought was, my younger child is only 4 years old. She has severe asthma and food allergies. How am I going to manage? And one of my advisors actually was Ambassador Peter Hansen of Denmark. And he said to me, what a stupid thought. Men never think like that. They never think, can I do the job? They will first say yes, and then they'll worry about how they will do the job. So, you know, this is one of the things that women need to do. They need to have a stronger sense of themselves and their self-esteem. They need to pick partners who appreciate that. You know, we sometimes think that that our partners in life are more feminist than they really are. You have to look at it with a cold lens. Are you really getting the support that you think you deserve? Um, and are you going to be able to build both your career and the community of women that you are representing in a way that is going to strengthen this process? Because ultimately, when we have an equitable world, the men can relax also too.
Hopefully. Yeah.
But yeah, I think that this conference mode is out. And I think COVID has also given a sort of death blow to this conference mode, because this was the first General Assembly that took place online. This was the first World Bank spring meetings that took place online. And yes, the work was at 60%, but 60% got done quite a lot. So the real work's at the local level.
Yeah, I agree.
And analyzing, researching, and then seeing best practices can be done in ways that don't require you to come to a 20,000 person conference. Although having been at these conferences, it's a memory I will never forget.
Yeah.
You know, arriving at Beijing airport and seeing a sea of women was, I mean, going in a plane all of women and then arriving there and seeing a sea of women was really incredible.
Right, right. I seem to recall that the last one was in Copenhagen, and it has but it was so much. It was very expensive to participate in the conference.
The one in 1995, the social summit.
No. Oh no, maybe it was another one. It's just another women conference, but it was kind of a bit elitist, and then have the queen, the so
Very
all these figures, Angelina Jolie, and then it became a bit like a. So I'm.
This is one of the criticisms I have of the UN, that they have too many goodwill ambassadors who are celebrities now. And many of those celebrities have nothing to do with the actual topic. I don't know whether any of you followed the controversy that took place when they tried to make the Wonder Woman cartoon figure.
Oh yeah, no, I didn't, but I remember there was something from.
So I'm one of the people who took that on and made them reverse that decision. Myself and somebody from the staff union. We were
Imagine that costume. The costume for the Wonder Woman.
They eventually had to back down. But I think that part of this is that there has been too much of this, and I hate to say this, a lot of these communication specialists who have joined the UN, who think in terms of the PR framework and not in terms of the substance framework. But I think the real work is really at the ground level, and at the community level, at the family level, which is very hard.
Well, this is a wonderful way of concluding, because our next lecture next Thursday is going to be about practitioners in Tanzania and practitioners in Lebanon, and they're really going to be talking about what is the projects on the field at the very local level, and so it will be very nice to as a sequence to this class. I think we're coming to an end now. I think it's been wonderful. I don't know if there is any concluding thoughts that you would like to share with us, and anything that we didn't hear.
No, I think that, as I said, you know, really, you are the people who are studying in business school and are going to end up in corporations in both Denmark and around the world. That's where the change really needs to come next.
Yeah.
So good luck, and I hope that you all will do very well in having both this inclusive and holistic framework in your mind as you build your careers. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for today. And I think this then concludes our afternoon meeting.